Let's go to Ithaca, New York, where Professor Rosemary Bott is standing by. She is the Alice Hanson Cook Professor of Women and Work at the Industrial and Labor Relations School at Cornell University. Thank you for joining us, Professor.
Thank you, David. I'm really glad to be here.
You and Eileen Applebaum wrote a great piece for the American Prospect. The article is entitled Private Equity Pillage, Grocery Stores and Workers at Risk. It's a great article. I recommend that everybody subscribe to American Prospect. So one of the goals on this show is to promote civic engagement. And I don't believe my listeners can be engaged unless they read the business page and understand the business page. Because if you don't understand how business works, you don't understand how big business is manipulating our government and then our lives. Private equity. You write about private equity in this piece. It sounds so Byzantine. My eyes glaze over when I say the word. When I say the word private equity, my eyes glaze over. That's what they want. They want us not to understand what private equity is. Let's start with the retail apocalypse. We're told Amazon has shut down Main Street. If you want to know why the malls are empty, it's because of Amazon. And now they're coming for local groceries. During the past 3 years, 7 grocery chains, Toys R Us, have declared bankruptcy. We'll get to the workers in a second and private equity's involvement in all this. Describe for us what's happening to the retail sector. What kind of future are shoppers looking at now because of all these bankruptcies?
First of all, the digital revolution, as we call it, has been affecting retail for quite some time. And over time, more people are buying things online, and so there's less need or demand for brick and mortar stores. And that's been particularly true in electronics or clothing, but now it has moved in this wider swath of retail and particularly recently into grocery stores. So one way to think about it is, yes, we have to take this seriously. There is a transformation going on, but it's not the apocalypse that some people say it is. We can think of many periods in history where there have been disruptive technologies. You can think of the automobile, you can think of telephone companies and telecommunications, the growth of iPhones. Telephone companies are making more money now than ever with disruptive technology. The shift from rotary phones to push-button phones, it took decades. So many Americans continue to use outdated technology. So I think the first thing we have to say is to look very reasonably at what's going on and say, yes, there are going to be some people or some stores that are thrown into bankruptcy. They have to think very hard about how to compete more effectively, and some of them are. So, for example, you've got stores that are doing both online and brick and mortar stores. You have Amazon now going into, right? They just bought Whole Foods. They're actually going into brick and mortar stores. So I don't think we should just give up and say, oh, there's just going to be a shutdown across the different sectors. But in fact, there are opportunities to turn things around.
People are social animals. We want to go out and shop. We want to touch things and be around people and talk to a salesperson. That's what makes us human.
Yes, and there are many things that people want to look at first, the kind of fabric or the kind of real detailed features. People still love to, go walking and do their exercise in indoor malls. So I think that we have to look carefully at what stores can do to revitalize themselves. A good example is Kroger's groceries. Kroger's is competing very, very effectively with Walmart and Amazon. It has better earnings than ever. It is a large chain throughout the United States, and it's just invested in its stores. It's invested in training its workers so that it can compete effectively, and it's doing so.
What does bankruptcy mean? I always thought that when a company declares bankruptcy, it goes out of business. But I've actually flown on airlines and was told by the stewardess midair that, by the way, we're bankrupt. Very unsettling to be 33,000 feet in midair and be told that. So just because you're bankrupt, it doesn't mean you're bankrupt. When these companies declare bankruptcy, they stay in business.
There are many different kinds of bankruptcy, but the bankruptcy laws were passed largely to try to keep businesses in business by helping them to restructure their debt. So bankruptcy means that you can't pay your debts. Your income, your revenues are not sufficient to pay the debts you have. And so bankruptcy, for example, Chapter 11 bankruptcy allows a company to basically file to reorganize their business and finances and to negotiate with their creditors either to get loan forgiveness or extended terms for repaying their loans. And in exchange, they promise to do certain things to make sure their businesses are healthy in the future. So that's one kind of bankruptcy. However, if a company has gone too far into debt, then it may have to actually liquidate or sell off its assets completely and stop doing business. So I'll give you an example with Toys R Us. Toys R Us filed for bankruptcy last year, decided to go out of business, and claimed it announced it was going to liquidate, and by that it means auction off all of its assets. But recently, just in October, the creditors, the people who own the assets, are now thinking about the fact that Toys R Us has such a great brand, and people were so upset about hearing about the bankruptcy that now they're thinking of redoing the company and reopening it under the same brand, but with a different organization. So that's how companies can revitalize themselves when mistakes are made or when we have a recession. And it may not be their fault that they've gone into bankruptcy.
So Toys R Us discovered that the name was almost as valuable as their assets. I think Trump discovered that in the 80s during one of his bankruptcies.
Well, the part of the assets are the kind of what they call intellectual property or the brand. The idea that people love, they have a warm feeling about Toys R Us. They've bought many of their own toys there or their children's toys, and so they love the store and they want to see it continue.
Right. And Toys R Us, we'll get to them in a second because I think they're the victim of private equity as well. These stores that are shutting down, you write primarily for the American Prospect about grocery stores. So what is happening to grocery stores around the country right now?
The same thing that has happened in other parts of retail is creeping into grocery stores. So you think about online grocery shopping now. Amazon introduced it, and now it's slowly, there are many new venture startups that are trying to figure out how to do home delivery of groceries. And so there is a transformation going on. There are also people who want things like, locally grown fruits and vegetables or, green products. So the grocery stores have to really invest in new ways of distributing their goods. They have to invest in new technologies. They have to invest in new suppliers. And so all of this costs money, and they operate on very, very thin margins. And so that is the struggle that these grocery stores are facing. Many people have argued that Amazon and Walmart are fundamentally transforming grocery stores just the way they did other parts of retail, and that means the grocery stores are going under. And what we say is that that's not the fundamental cause of recent bankruptcy in grocery stores.
Yeah, let's get to that in a second because it's a little complicated. So I want to set the table so people can understand what private equity means, because I just kind of learned what private equity means. The impact on workers. Grocery stores, you write, are highly unionized?
Yes, they are. So retail in general is not highly unionized, but grocery stores are quite unionized. I think it's in the range of 40% or 30 to 40%. 7 grocery store chains have gone bankrupt since 2015.
Since 2015. And they're still in business, though.
They're still in business, but they have shrunk. So they have sold off some of their stores, and they are much smaller entities now. About 125,000 workers in these stores were affected by the bankruptcies.
125,000 workers, and most of them are union. What happens to the union contracts when you're going through a bankruptcy?
It depends on a number of factors. If it's the same owner, then the owner has responsibility to continue to recognize the union and to pay the same wages and benefits. However, the owner may come to the union and say, we can't survive unless you take concessions, and that may mean changing the benefit structure or usually not reducing wages, but it may have to do with cutbacks in benefits. The other major problem is that if a company goes through bankruptcy, the creditors, there are different levels of creditors, and the senior creditors are the ones who get paid off first, and then the union and the pension funds in particular. And so pension funds may be at risk, and often what happens is that the company will say it cannot pay the pension liabilities, and so it turns the pension over to what is called the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, which is an insurance, a kind of quasi-government insurance company who would then take over the pension fund. The problem with that is that that insurance company does not pay the level of pensions that were guaranteed to the workers under the union contract.
All right, time to do some heavy lifting. How are you holding up?
Good.
Okay. Private equity. I think in the next 10 years, the bane of our existence is going to be private equity, but we may not even know that it's private equity because we don't understand it. The bane of our existence is Bain Capital. Bain Capital, I believe, was one of the private equity firms that was behind Toys R Us. Back in 2012, Mitt Romney was the Republican nominee for president. We heard a lot about Bain Capital. Bain Capital is a private equity firm. Is that correct? So define what a private equity firm is. What is the difference between private equity and a stock that is traded on Wall Street?
Right. So first let me say that we've all heard of Bain Capital, but Bain is one of a few thousand private equity firms. So we probably now have about 3,000 private equity firms operating in the United States, and they have employed more workers than there are union workers in the country right now. Private equity firms are firms that raise an investment fund by going to wealthy individuals or pension funds or insurance companies. They raise an investment fund, and then they use that fund to buy up companies and take them private.
There's a company, let's say Bain, and they go to all their rich friends and they say, put $1 billion into this account, and we will take that $1 billion and then go look for publicly traded corporations on the New York Stock Exchange and buy up all the shares of that company, and then it's no longer traded on the New York Stock Exchange. We own it outright.
That's right.
So it becomes private equity as opposed to a publicly traded stock. So you don't even know how the business is doing anymore once it becomes private equity. In other words, you could take a company like Staples that's traded on the stock market and raise enough money to just buy up all the shares, and it becomes private, and it's no longer a stock that's traded on the New York Stock Exchange.
Right.
Okay.
So that's about 80% of private equity firms make money in that way. And the idea is that they look for companies that have good fundamentals, that are actually well run, but they may be underpriced on the stock exchange for some reason. And so they can go in and provide a little bit higher stock price, and most shareholders are willing to buy, willing to sell, and so they're able to take control of that company. They do so because they think they can make certain changes in the company that will make it more valuable, and then within a short period of time, they can resell it and make money, which they then return to their investors.
So the positive spin on this, if you go to Wharton or you get your Harvard MBA and you go back for Christmas and Thanksgiving to tell your loved ones what you do for a living, your noble cause, the lie that you tell is, we take struggling publicly traded companies that are not doing well, we raise capital, we buy these struggling companies, and we turn them around, and we make them profitable so that they can stay in business. And then we sell them to somebody who wants to run a successful company. That's the lie that they tell so they can fall asleep at night, that they're doing a public good. They're saving a corporation from itself.
We need to look at a wide range of private equity firms because they do different things. There are, in fact, some private equity firms that have been able to help distressed or struggling companies. That's true. They may provide financing. They may help them get to scale. They may, provide turnaround. They have sophisticated accounting systems and HR systems, particularly for small companies. So it is possible for private equity firms to help smaller companies or struggling companies. However, most of the capital that private equity firms invest.
And capital is money.
Yeah, the investment funds. Most of that capital does not go into distressed companies or small companies. It goes into large buyouts of perhaps $500 or $1 billion or more. And here, the companies may be not doing quite as well in the stock market as they could, but they have strong fundamentals. So the private equity firm can take that company private and do a series of things that potentially put that company at greater risk. And the biggest thing they do is they buy the company using a high percentage of debt, which they load on the company. That's why this model is called a leveraged buyout. In other words, they put 70% of the price of the company comes from loans from banks, whereas they only use 30% of the investment fund, perhaps, to contribute to buying the company.
Okay, this is great. This is fantastic. Thank you for doing this. We hear the term leveraged buyout. Leverage means what?
Leverage means you are taking your own money and leveraging it to get a higher amount by getting a loan from a bank or another creditor.
So leverage is credit, using your money to get more money that you're going to end up owing.
Right, but the trick is that when a private citizen does this, for example, I go to the bank and get a mortgage, I am responsible for repaying that mortgage. When private equity goes to the bank to get a loan to buy a portfolio company, it also puts that debt on the portfolio company. This
is really great. Let's just slow down here, because once we understand this, we can understand why Toys R Us went bankrupt and why these grocery stores are going bankrupt, and the myth of Amazon, that it's Amazon that's creating all these problems. It's really private equity. Corporate raiders. If you watch Wall Street, Gordon Gekko, he wasn't a private equity firm so much as he was a corporate raider from the 80s who would just go in and buy a company and then sell off all the assets and make a profit. That's what Gordon Gekko was doing in Wall Street. A leveraged buyout means...
That's the same thing. So the private equity model basically took the leveraged buyout model from the 80s, the Gordon Gekko model, and modernized it and called it a different name beginning in the late 1990s or 2000s. It's a very similar process.
Did this stuff happen before the 80s? Weren't there laws to protect hostile takeovers and how much leverage you could use?
The model emerged in the 70s, and there really haven't been any laws that prevent hostile takeovers. There have been, subsequent efforts and strategies to avoid that, like through poison pills or things like that, where a company will buy its own stock back and prevent a takeover, a hostile takeover. There aren't laws per se that rule against this.
But are there regulations that limit the amount of debt that you can assume when taking on a corporation? I thought at one time there was a regulation that limited the amount of debt you could use to take a public company private. But so let's talk about Toys R Us and grocery stores. You have a nice publicly traded grocery store, and a private equity firm decides to buy it, and they use a lot of debt or leverage. What happens? How does the private equity firm make money?
So the private equity firm makes money in a couple of ways. By loading the company with debt, it puts pressure on the management to, what I would say, squeeze costs, because the management of the company has got to service the debt. And so that may lead the company to reduce jobs or find other ways to cut costs in order to service the debt. And so the grocery store often looks to labor costs to reduce costs in order to service the debt. The other ways of making money, private equity firm can load more debt on the company. It's called a dividend recapitalization, which is a fancy word for saying, I'm going to take out another loan from a bank. I'm going to load it on the company, but I'm going to, instead of using that money to invest in the grocery store and upgrade it so it can compete more effectively, I'm going to pay myself and my private equity investors dividends.
Wow.
So I'm just loading the company with more debt in order to pay myself a dividend.
Wow.
A third way that I can make money from owning the supermarkets is the supermarket often owns its own property. Mm-hmm. Retail typically owns their own property, and they do so because in the event of a downturn in the economy, it can continue to survive because it doesn't have to pay rent. The volume of their sales may go down, so they may have to have fewer workers during that down period, but they can survive. But with private equity, one of their classic moves is they separate a company between a property company and an operating company. And the property is actually sold off to another real estate firm. And then the existing store has to pay rent, usually inflated rent by this time, on property that it used to own.
Wow.
And then private equity can make money off the sale of that property, pay themselves and their investors. But the operating company is more at risk. It's financially at risk because it doesn't have that cushion of owning its own property.
So it's a group of 10 guys on Wall Street who are parasites, literally sucking everything out of a company till there's nothing left, and then it goes belly up. Everybody loses their jobs, the company disappears, but these private equity investors walk away with all the money. It's almost like buying a house, gutting the copper wiring, taking the ducts, the furniture, whatever's left in there, and selling it off and leaving a shell of a house and walking away from it and not paying the mortgage on it.
That may be a reasonable metaphor.
Maybe
I would also say that there's a wide range in what happens. Not all companies that are bought by private equity go bankrupt. But private equity needs to make outsized returns because it's promised its investors that it will pay them higher than it will pay the stock market. So they have to figure out how to get enough out of the companies that it purchases to make it worthwhile their investment. And so there is the extraction of value in order to pay back the investors at a higher rate than they would get in the stock market.
And these are short-term gains because there's a limit to how much you can pull out of a company before there's nothing left.
Right.
Wow.
So you need to
keep looking
the typical turnaround time or exit time used to be about 3 to 5 years, and now it's 6 years is the latest figure, which means that the private equity firms are actually having a harder time selling their companies than they did in the past.
Now, there are fewer and fewer publicly traded companies to buy on Wall Street. Is that because private equity is buying them up?
Well, a number of things have happened to reduce the number of publicly traded companies. One is that they're consolidating into larger entities. Mm-hmm. Another is that there are owners such as private equity that are taking them private. And there are pressures on Wall Street companies, the pressures on to deliver short-term returns that in some cases lead them to think that they want to go private because then they are out of the eye of shareholders and they need time to restructure.
Hey, I can't thank you enough for this. This is so informative, and it's going to help me and my listeners read the newspaper. Remember newspapers? Read the business section of whatever website they go to and understand the phrase private equity. How much transparency is there with private equity vis-a-vis the stock market? Does the government have oversight when it comes to private equity? I know they have oversight when it comes to stock. And you buy stock in, say, Apple, if you're lucky enough, the government is supposedly keeping an eye on the corporation. How much oversight is there with private equity?
There's minimal. There's very minimal oversight. Under the Dodd-Frank Act that was passed in 2010, mm-hmm. Under the Dodd-Frank Act, private equity and hedge funds have certain requirements for their managers to submit information to the Securities and Exchange Commission. So they do have to submit annual reports. But the reports require minimal information, nothing on the scale that a publicly traded corporation would be required to produce. And most of the information that the private equity firms submit remains private. In other words, it is not publicly available to people through the SEC. So it gives them a great amount of opacity, and most of the transactions and most of the information about private equity firms is private. So there's little or no transparency in how they go about buying companies, when they take them private, what they actually do with those companies, the agreements between the private equity firm and their what are called their investor limited partners. Those agreements are also completely private and confidential. You can't find out what the arrangements are that the investors are paying, or the fees and evaluations, all sorts of financial information. You cannot find that out. So private equity firms operate with just little or no oversight or transparency.
Is more money now being invested in private equity than it is the stock market? Or is it equal? It's about the same?
No. It's a small amount compared to the stock market. I mean, private equity is a growing player, but it's not a dominant player by any means. One thing that is true is that the kinds of strategies used by private equity are increasingly being used in publicly traded corporations.
What do you mean?
for example, publicly traded corporations are making greater use of debt than they did before. They don't use debt at the highest level as private equity does, but they do use higher levels of debt, and that may be of great concern. For example, shareholders who are risk averse may worry about higher use of debt, particularly if faced with a downturn in the economy.
So a stock like Amazon issues bonds, and that's debt.
Mm-hmm.
And then that gives them the leverage to keep buying all these businesses, and even if they're not profitable, it doesn't matter because it's being paid for by these bonds. And corporate debt now is the largest it's ever been. It's pre-2008.
I think so, yeah.
Wow. When we read about these bankruptcies, Professor, when we read about these grocery stores going under, when we read about Toys R Us declaring bankruptcy, we have to have a cynical eye and not say, oh, people's shopping behavior has changed. It may have nothing to do with how we shop. It may have nothing to do with Amazon. It could just be a leveraged buyout where private equity is trying to turn a profit by gutting a company.
Well, it's making a profit by using the leverage buyout model to throw a lot of debt on the company, to kind of squeeze costs out of the company, to often use that company to take out more loans and pay itself a dividend, or to sell off the property of that grocery store chain and then pay itself more dividends. And so the way to think about private equity is that they view companies as like Lego sets, pieces to be bought and sold for money. They use whatever strategies they can to figure out how to reconfigure those companies or buy and sell bits and pieces of them in order to make money before they turn them around and sell them to somebody else.
And you're saying that a lot of these retail outlets have a holistic investment approach where they own real estate to get them through the downturns, but when you break it all into little pieces, it can't survive.
Right. And so, again, a good example is Kroger's is an example of a company that has continued to invest. It's grown organically, so it's grown by expanding itself over the years. It's also invested in its grocery stores at a time when profit margins are thin. It's revamping all of its grocery stores. It's got a big strategy to improve lots of the customer experience and online grocery and grocery delivery and all sorts of innovative ways that make people want to keep coming back. So grocery stores and retail can survive, but they need to have the resources to do so and to kind of respond to the new era that we're in. And some companies are doing that, and private equity, by throwing so much debt onto retail companies, doesn't give them much wiggle room to be able to survive and compete effectively.
Our next president, Senator Elizabeth Warren, introduced legislation demanding the German model for corporations, where I think 40% of the people who sit on the board of directors of a corporation have to represent either the unions or the workers. That would change everything, wouldn't it?
That's a very different model that brings a whole lot more stakeholders and different perspectives and interests into the decision-making process.
And Germany is doing just fine with that model. Well, I cannot thank you enough for taking time to explain all this complicated stuff. And it's supposed to be complicated. So one of the things I learned from Ralph Nader is if you don't understand something, they probably don't want you to understand this. So once again, thank you. We've been talking with Professor Rosemary Bott, and I recommend that everybody subscribe to the American Prospect and read her piece she wrote with Eileen Applebaum. It's entitled Private Equity Pillage, Grocery Stores and Workers at Risk. Thank you so much. You were very generous with your time.
Thank you very much, David. I've really enjoyed it.
Can you stay on the line for 1 second?
Sure.